The Vatican concluded its first treaty that formally recognizes the state of Palestine, with an agreement on Catholic Church activities in areas controlled by the Palestinian Authority. The Vatican's deputy foreign minister said the agreement aims to enhance the life and activities of the Catholic Church and its recognition at the judicial level.
Well, it's official. A state within a country has just recognized another would-be state within a country. The Vatican has granted formal recognition to the state of Palestine, and Israel is not pleased. Why is Pope Francis calling President Abbas an angel of peace? Why cuddle up to Palestine? All worthy questions for my next guest, Israeli relations expert Philippe Assouline. Philippe, as always, great to have you here.
Good to see you again, Tomi.
Philippe, does the recognition of Palestine by the Vatican change anything, and why now?
Well, it actually happened in 2012, but now they're giving it like real legal weight in the treaty you're mentioning. Why now? I think it's done to defend or protect the Christian population in the Middle East. And it could have an impact on Israel, but hopefully it'll have an impact in the first case. I think whatever you said describing the agreement is some kind of code for protecting the Palestinian Christian population. Christians in the Middle East are suffering a genocide, not even exaggerating. And the Palestinian population is not exempt. The population of Bethlehem used to be 95% Christian 100 years ago. Now it's about 10 or 15 or even less, depending on who's counting. So this might be a way of with kid gloves, protecting the Christian population there.
And that's a worthy cause, but I wonder, why cuddle up to them? Why cozy up to President Abbas? If you're trying to protect the Christians there, I realize that the Pope has a different role than, say, maybe what our leaders should have, the President of the United States should have. But goodness, it seems a little odd to me if you're trying to protect people, if there is in fact a genocide going on in those regions, why cuddle up to the President of the nation that's doing it, that's causing the destruction, that's causing the genocide?
There's a real strategic problem you identified here, and it's been going on for decades, and I can't really explain it. It boggles the mind a bit. If you're Abbas, you just have to sit there and wait for the world to recognize you, put pressure on Israel, and the offers keep getting better, and you can keep rejecting them, and eventually you're going to get what you want. It's like if you're trying to buy a house, and you know the owner who's trying to sell it to you is going to be evicted, you're already getting your mail sent there, and you're going to get it for free. So from that point of view, this is not going to lead to an improvement in any situation in terms of peace and compromise. From the Palestinian perspective, it's great because the Pope, in theory at least, influences, what, 1 billion people on the planet, in theory? So for them, it's great. It's a lot of moral support. Will it lead to anything in practice that is helpful to them or the Israelis? No, I don't think so.
Well, and also logistically, I'm a little confused. How can you recognize a state with no borders, comprised of two entities ruled by two different governments? It seems like you're putting the cart before the horse here a little bit.
Yes, absolutely. The Vatican took until 1993 to recognize Israel. That's 45 years of existence, 5 wars, a lot of different things. Here, you have states falling over each other to recognize an entity that is split between Hamas, as you said, and Fatah. The borders are not clear. There's never been borders there, so we don't even know what to refer to. The borders that have been proposed have been rejected. And again, I agree with you. I think this is not only putting the cart before the horse, it's tripping the horse, because this is not going to lead to anybody wanting to compromise.
And let's talk about that. Let's talk about what it means for peace in the region, because we know that Israel was disappointed with the Pope's decision, with the Vatican's decision to officially recognize the state of Palestine because of the implications it would have on peace in the region. Can you explain to our viewers why that's important?
Right. So the idea is, what I've been saying is that the Palestinians, not many people know this, but they've rejected peace offers that would have given them what they say they want at least 3 times in the last 15 years. So the idea here is, if you keep giving them recognition and putting pressure on Israel and giving them the trappings of a state, they don't really have any imperative or incentive to compromise. But I don't think the Israelis are doing themselves a favor by complaining to the Vatican. There's no victims in politics. The Israelis are the ones who should be putting their message across and getting the point across. And the Netanyahu government hasn't done that effectively with anybody outside of people who already support Israel. So Abbas doesn't have any incentive to make peace. The Israelis are not doing anything to change the case in people's minds, and it's just, I think, going to continue in this direction.
Well, that's what I'm wondering here. You mentioned before they've rejected a lot of potential solutions to this problem. We know we've discussed this before, a one-state solution, a two-state solution. President Abbas doesn't want to come to the table. Besides taking over the entire Jewish state of Israel, what would make the Palestinians happy at this point? What would bring them to the table? Could we do anything? Could Israel do anything to win?
The Palestinians already, it's very difficult to know what they want, because the last election was 10 years ago. Hamas is the Palestinians. They definitely wouldn't negotiate with Israel no matter what happens. And Abbas represents X number of people. There's a lot of conflicting positions here. I think the best thing Israel can do is bypass the Palestinian governments now because they're acting a bit irresponsibly and negotiate with the Arab League. And the Arab League is talking about this a little bit.
We hope that that's something that can happen in the future, because I don't think that the status quo is working. We haven't heard a lot, though, at least in the recent weeks, about what's going on. Can you give us a little bit of an update before we move on? What is the state of Jerusalem like right now? Is there still violence in the region? Is there still ongoing terrorist attacks, suicide attacks? What do we have going on right now?
There's always terrorist attacks, unfortunately, recurring. It's not as tense as it was a couple of months after the war in Gaza, when Hamas was instigating people. That's when you had me on graciously. We talked about the massacre of the rabbis in the synagogue. But it's a powder keg. Netanyahu likes to talk about a united Jerusalem, but in practice, the positions are hardening on both sides. And on the Palestinian side, you have a lot of incitement to violence, which translate into episodical, periodical car ramming attacks. There was one a couple of weeks ago at a bus station. So it's very tense. It is likely to get inflamed at any kind of disturbance. And there is regular violence. Stone throwing, of course, is common in certain areas.
And we're always sad to hear that we're not hearing a lot about it in the media, so it's always important for you to give us that update. One thing I'm also not hearing a lot about, I guess, in the mainstream media is the state of Israel right now as far as its borders, as far as the refugees from the Middle East and Africa that are surging into Israel right now. Israel's actually having to turn some away. Can you explain the situation and why they are turning away these so-called infiltrators away from Israel?
Yes. So again, thank you so much, because this is the only venue I know of where people can get in depth and be on the headlines on such issues. So for about, say, 6-7 years, you've had waves of migrants from Africa, Eritrea and Sudan in particular, coming to Israel claiming to be refugees. And the government hasn't really done much in terms of policy, so it's let them come in, it's let them work kind of in the dark without really giving them work permits. And you have a population of about 50,000-60,000 Africans, mostly in the south of Tel Aviv, and that's scaring people who live there. Now, this phenomenon, because of the wars in North Africa and the Middle East, is becoming widespread. Europe now has to deal with waves of migrants from Africa as well. So Israel basically resorted to the solution the Americans are resorting to. It put up a fence, put up detention centers, and is screening very strictly for who's refugees and who's not, even though their legal system is not adequate enough. Europe, which was always the bastion of open arms and welcoming people in, now decided it's going to use its military forces to limit smuggling efforts. It's a problem that nobody really has a good solution to, neither does the Israeli government. And the Supreme Court is watching over the government to make sure it's not too harsh on these migrants, because a lot of them are refugees.
Because critics of Israel right now are saying that as a nation of refugees, it's hypocritical for them to turn away refugees. But as we're seeing right here in the United States, we would love to take everybody. That's not possible. We have to protect our borders as well. And one thing that I actually see on the opposite side is some of these measures you mentioned, like building a fence, turning away people that are applying for these work permits, might actually save lives because it discourages them from making that journey if they know that when they're trying to get in, they're going to be turned away. Do you think that there's any sense of that?
I think everything you said makes sense. It's true that Jews have historically maybe more sensitivity to this and a historical responsibility. In the 1970s, Israel was one of the only countries to accept Vietnamese boat people refugees. So it should be, at least ideally, in the tradition. On the other hand, it wasn't tenable because you have a lot of people who come in who are not refugees, and you start to really shift the demographic balance in cities, it becomes a problem. The argument is they're not going to be exposed to the horrific things they went through in the Sinai. While getting to Israel, in the Sinai, the Bedouin tribes would steal people's organs and slavery, really awful stuff. And yeah, it's stopping people to go through there, but those same people are probably going to go through another route and face danger in other places. It's just a bad situation in Central and North Africa now.
And we know how our president has handled our immigration situation, but Israel seems to be a little bit more firm than, shall we say, President Obama. Do you think they'll hold firm to their immigration and their asylum policies, even as they are getting the bad publicity and the bad press from the critics?
I believe so. I mean, just to underline the point you're making, they're actually paying people $3,500 to leave, to go back to their to some countries in Africa with whom they made agreements. This, in combination with the fact that you have a right-wing government now, like pretty hard right, who all the parties want to see this happen, and you have a lot of discontent in Tel Aviv because for years it was neglected. There was no effort to integrate these people. So you have like these sections of the city that people don't even recognize anymore. So for the time being, I think it'll last. The obstacle is going to be the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court has already stepped in and said, you can't do this. This is not, it's contrary to our values. You need to protect people from unjust imprisonment and things of that kind.
So my final question for you is, why are they turning these migrants away? We know the critics are saying that they should welcome with open arms. What would the political climate or the economic climate of Israel be if they simply opened their borders, let everybody, every refugee in?
Well, it's a good question, but the reason they stopped letting people in is because the flow was too big to integrate. And also, there's always a fear on the Israeli side because of everything going on, because maybe of Jewish history, that the demographic balance is going to shift. Most of these people who came from Africa were Muslim. They're African, differences in culture, and it was causing some kind of friction. I don't know if it's deserved. I personally would have chosen other avenues to integrate them, or tried them at least. But the flow was way too large, tens of thousands a month at times, or definitely tens of thousands every year, and it was just too much for such a small country and economy to integrate. Because on top of the economic side, there's all kinds of cultural issues that people in Israel have health care, they have free education, and so a lot of concerns converged. But it could have been done in a more sensitive fashion.
And we know that hindsight is always 20/20 here, but we see in the United States what happens when you open up your borders. It's not a stable situation. You know, maybe a better system be put in place, but to criticize Israel, as people often do, I don't think is fair. But thank you, Philippe, for coming on and explaining it to everyone, because not many people are going to hear that side of it. Next, the